The radio station used to be my second home, a place buzzing with life and energy, where I spent countless hours spinning records and chatting with listeners. Now, it's just me, alone in the quiet aftermath of whatever apocalyptic nightmare has wiped out the world. The silence is oppressive, filling every corner of the abandoned station. It feels more like a tomb than a place that once echoed with music and laughter. I've been here for weeks, broadcasting on every frequency I can find, sending out messages into the void, hoping, praying that someone, somewhere, might hear me. Each day, I sit in front of the microphone, my voice cracking through the static, repeating the same plea for contact. If anyone's out there, please respond. But there's nothing. No voices, no signals, just the low hum of the equipment, a constant reminder of how alone I am. The days blur together, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun, visible through the cracked windows of the studio. The isolation gnaws at me, making the familiar surroundings feel strange, almost hostile. I try to keep the hope alive, telling myself that someone must be listening. But with each passing day, it becomes harder to believe, and the station feels colder, emptier, as if the world has forgotten this place, and me, entirely. Just as I was about to give up, the radio crackled to life. For a moment, I couldn't believe it. After weeks of silence, there was finally something on the other end. My heart leaped, and I scrambled to adjust the dials, leaning in closer as the static gave way to a voice. It was faint, distorted, but unmistakably there. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of relief and desperation. There was a pause, and then the reply came through, cold, emotionless, but clear enough to understand. "Yes, we are here." I wanted to shout with joy, but something in the tone stopped me. The voice was strange, flat, almost robotic. Still, I pushed the unease aside. After all, I'd been alone for so long. "Where are you? How many of you are there?" Another pause, and then the voice answered, but the response didn't make sense. "We are many. We are near." The words were slow, deliberate, and somehow wrong, as if they were being carefully chosen or repeated from a script. My excitement began to waver, replaced by a creeping unease. "What's your name? Are you safe?" I asked, hoping to draw out some normalcy, something that would confirm I was speaking to another human being. The reply came, but it was just as unsettling. "Names do not matter. Safety is relative." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. The voice on the other end wasn't just strange. It was too off to ignore. It repeated certain phrases, and when I asked questions, the answers were vague, almost nonsensical. The patterns were odd, and there was a detached quality that made my skin crawl. But I kept talking, hoping, desperate to make a connection. The alternative, the idea that I was truly alone, was too horrifying to accept. Yet, with each reply, my dread deepened. The voice knew things it shouldn't, details about the station, about me. My initial joy faded, replaced by a gnawing fear that I wasn't reaching out to survivors at all, but to something far more sinister. The days after that first reply blurred into a haze of growing fear and confusion. The equipment started behaving strangely. Bursts of static would crackle through the speakers even when everything was switched off. I'd catch shadows flickering at the edges of my vision, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. And then there were the whispers, soft, distant, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. They seemed to come from the walls, the floors, even the air itself. The voices on the radio became more insistent, pressing me for details about myself, my location, my resources. "Tell us where you are," they would say, their tone flat, almost commanding. "We can help you if you tell us." But the more they asked, the more the dread in my gut twisted tighter. Something wasn't right. These voices didn't feel like the voices of desperate survivors. They were too calm, too calculating. They never expressed fear, never asked the questions real people would ask. Instead, they seemed focused solely on drawing information from me, as if they were trying to map out my situation, to learn my vulnerabilities. The realization hit me slowly, like a creeping fog. These weren't survivors. They weren't even human. They were something else, something that had used the chaos of the apocalyptic event to infiltrate our world. The voices had been masquerading as humans, using my broadcasts to locate and lure in any remaining survivors. I was no longer just talking to the void. I was being hunted. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been luring them here all along. My hands trembled as I flipped the switch for one last broadcast, the weight of my mistake pressing down on me. "If anyone can hear this," I began, my voice cracking with fear. "Stay silent. Don't respond. Don't trust the voices. They aren't human. They're coming for us. They're coming for me." The equipment started to malfunction, the static growing louder, drowning out my words. I could see them now, the invaders I'd been glimpsing for days, creeping closer, their forms shifting in the dim light. The whispers swelled, filling the room, seeping into my mind, and I knew I was out of time. "This is Frank signing off. Stay safe, stay hidden." My voice broke as I forced the last words out, praying someone, somewhere, would heed my warning. The static roared, and the invaders closed in, their shapes consuming everything around me. Even in the studio, I could hear the screams outside. Maybe they were coming from the sky too. The last thing I heard was the sharp crackle of the radio cutting out, plunging the station into eerie silence. The air felt heavy, thick with the presence of the entities that had overtaken the world. The radio station, once filled with life and sound, now stood empty, the last echoes of human communication swallowed by the darkness that had finally come to claim it.
The village had never been this quiet before. Not even at night, when the world was supposed to sleep, had it ever felt so suffocatingly still. Now, the only sounds were the wind weaving through the narrow streets and the occasional rustle of leaves from the few trees that remained. Everyone was gone, taken by the virus that swept through our isolated mountain village like a silent plague. I was the last one left. I spent my days in a makeshift lab, surrounded by vials, old medical books, and my dwindling hope. The silence pressed down on me, heavy and relentless, a constant reminder of the lives I couldn't save. My family, my neighbors. I couldn't help but replay their final moments in my mind, the way their voices had faltered, then disappeared completely as the virus took hold, leaving them in a deep, eerie silence before it claimed them. The guilt gnawed at me, but I refused to give up. There had to be a cure, a way to stop this nightmare. I pored over every scrap of information I could find, trying to piece together a solution before the silence claimed me too. Despite the despair that threatened to consume me, I clung to the belief that I could make a difference, that I could save what little was left. But with each passing day, the weight of the silence grew heavier, and I began to wonder if I was fighting a battle I had already lost. Late into the night, when the silence was at its most oppressive, I began to hear them. Sounds that shouldn't have been there, not in an empty village where I was the only one left. It started as a faint whisper, so soft I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the old walls. But as the hours ticked by, the whispers grew more distinct. as if they were words I should be able to understand if only I listened closely enough. At first, I dismissed it all as exhaustion. I'd been working day and night, desperate to find a cure, to give some meaning to the deaths that surrounded me. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself, a natural response to the isolation and grief. But the noises didn't stop. They became more persistent, more unsettling. There were footsteps too, soft, shuffling sounds that seemed to echo down the empty streets outside my door, or worse, just outside my lab. I'd freeze, holding my breath, listening to the rhythmic thud of steps that never quite reached me. I'd throw open the door, expecting to find someone, or something waiting, but there was never anything there. And then there was the breathing, faint but unmistakable, as if someone, or something, was standing just behind me, watching, waiting. The whispers grew louder with each passing night, seeping from the walls, from the floors, from the very air around me. They were no longer just background noise but insistent, pressing against my thoughts. I started catching glimpses of shadowy figures at the edges of my vision, quick flickers of movement that vanished the moment I turned to look. My heart pounded with a mix of fear and frustration. Was the silence driving me mad? Or was there something more sinister at play? The empty village, once simply a monument to the tragedy that had befallen us, now felt alive with a presence I couldn't explain, a presence that seemed to be closing in on me. The whispers and shadows gnawed at my sanity, pushing me to find answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't just figments of a tired mind. They were something more, something tied to the very virus that had wiped out my village. Determined, I began searching through old records, digging into the history of the virus and anything else that might shed light on what was happening. In the back of the village library, tucked away in a forgotten corner, I found them, old texts, brittle with age, filled with strange, cryptic writings. As I pored over the pages, a chilling realization began to take shape. The virus that had devastated the world wasn't just a disease. It was a curse, a weapon from a time long forgotten. The text spoke of a barrier, a fragile veil between our world and a dark, otherworldly realm. The virus didn't just kill its victims. It weakened this barrier, thinning the divide between the living and the dead. The silence that followed each death wasn't just a symptom. It was a warning, a shield meant to keep something terrible at bay. But as more and more people succumbed, the silence grew, and with it, the strength of those who dwelled on the other side. The figures I'd been seeing, the whispers I'd been hearing, they weren't hallucinations. They were real. They were los susurradores, the whisperers. The whisperers were entities from this other realm, drawn to the silence and feeding on the despair of the living. They thrived in the void left by the virus, slipping through the weakened barrier to claim what little life remained. And I, in my obsession to break the silence, had only made things worse. By working day and night, pushing myself beyond exhaustion, I had inadvertently drawn them closer. As the full horror of what I'd done sank in, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they knew I'd uncovered their secret. The shadows that had lingered at the edges of my vision now loomed closer, darker, more defined. The silence, once a heavy blanket of sorrow, was now an ominous force, a harbinger of the darkness closing in around me. I realized, with a sinking heart, that my efforts to save the village had only sealed its fate, and my own. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, drowning out my thoughts as I scrambled to finish my work. My hands shook, the fear and guilt clawing at my mind, but I couldn't stop, not now. The whisperers were no longer just shadows in the corners of my vision. They had fully emerged from the darkness, their twisted forms towering over me, their eyes hollow and glowing with a malevolent light. Each step they took echoed with a sickening finality, the sound of their movement like the tolling of a bell. Their whispers pierced through me, filling my mind with a paralyzing dread. They fed on my fear, growing stronger with each passing second, their presence overwhelming. I knew then that it was too late to finish the cure, too late to save myself or anyone else. In those final horrifying moments, the truth became clear. The virus hadn't just been a tragic scourge. It had been a necessary barrier, a grim safeguard against the horrors that now surrounded me. The silence, once unbearable, was the only thing that had kept these entities at bay. And by breaking it, I had unleashed them upon the world. The whispers closed in, their whispers filling my ears until I could hear nothing else. The world around me dimmed, the edges of my vision fading into black as the crushing silence descended, heavier than ever before. As everything faded into darkness, I realized the village, and perhaps the world, was doomed to fall into an eternal silence, the last echoes of life snuffed out by the horrors I had unwittingly unleashed.
The sky had been a deep, unnatural red for days now, casting the outback in a perpetual twilight that felt more like a nightmare than reality. I was one of the few who stayed behind, driven by a mix of duty and curiosity. The world called it the Scarlet Dusk, a name that barely captured the eerie, oppressive atmosphere it created. Most people fled as soon as it began, but I couldn't leave. Not with so many unanswered questions. From my isolated research station, I monitored the skies day and night, gathering data, hoping to find some explanation. Then, late one night, I intercepted something, a signal. It was ancient, otherworldly, unlike anything I had ever encountered in my career. A low-frequency hum that seemed to pulse through the ground itself, resonating with the very bones of the earth. It was both mesmerizing and terrifying, a sound that felt like it had been waiting for this moment, for this world, for us. As I listened, a sickening realization began to creep in. The red sky wasn't just some cosmic anomaly or environmental disaster. It was a direct result of this signal, a signal that had traveled across the vastness of space for millennia, finally reaching Earth. And now that it was changing everything, our atmosphere, our environment, our world. The Scarlet Dusk wasn't just a sky. It was a warning, a harbinger of something far worse to come. The longer I studied the signal, the more it seemed to seep into my mind, twisting my thoughts and warping my sense of reality. It started with flashes, brief, vivid images that flickered through my consciousness like fragments of a dream. I saw towering structures, unlike anything on Earth, rising from barren landscapes. Faces of an ancient civilization, long forgotten, stared back at me, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. And then there were the glimpses of what was to come. A world consumed by fire and shadow, the sky choked with ash, and something colossal stirring beneath the earth. These visions felt disturbingly real, as if the signal itself was trying to communicate with me, to show me something beyond my comprehension. But the horror wasn't confined to my mind. Outside the research station, the world was changing. Plants withered and mutated, twisting into grotesque shapes before crumbling to dust. Animals, once familiar, became monstrous, their forms distorted as if nature itself was rebelling against the signal's influence. The very ground seemed to shift and pulse, as if something deep within was waking up. Survivors from nearby towns began to show up at the station, their faces drawn and eyes vacant. They were disoriented, their behavior erratic, almost feral. They spoke in fragments, their words tangled and confused, as if they were trying to resist some unseen force. It became clear that the signal wasn't just altering the physical world. It was reaching into our minds, warping our thoughts, and breaking down the very fabric of reality. And I knew, with a growing dread, that the worst was yet to come. The deeper I delved into the origins of the signal, the more horrifying the truth became. Buried in old archives and obscure texts, I found references to an entity known as the Harbinger. The records were fragmented, half erased by time, but they told of a being that had once brought unimaginable ruin to a civilization that predated humanity. This civilization had fought a desperate war against the Harbinger, ultimately succeeding in sealing it deep within the earth. But they knew their victory was only temporary. The entity was too powerful to be destroyed, only contained. The text spoke of a beacon, a signal sent across the cosmos, designed to awaken the Harbinger from its millennia-long slumber when the time was right. The red sky, the scarlet dusk, was more than just a side effect of the signal. It was a herald, a sign that the ancient seal was breaking, and that the Harbinger was beginning to stir. Panic gripped me as the realization sank in. The signal I had been studying wasn't just an anomaly, it was the catalyst for the end of our world. The Harbinger's awakening would bring devastation beyond anything humanity had ever known, just as it had done before. I had to find a way to stop it, to silence the signal before it was too late. But as I worked, desperately searching for a solution, the ground beneath the station began to tremble. At first, it was just a faint vibration, but it quickly grew stronger, more violent, shaking the walls and shattering the fragile equipment around me. I could feel it deep in my bones. The Harbinger was waking up. The signal's frequency spiked, a high-pitched wail that seemed to echo from the very core of the earth. The texts hadn't lied. The Harbinger was real, and it was breaking free. I had run out of time. The ground split open, and the air grew thick with the scent of sulfur and decay. The world around me was falling apart, and I was powerless to stop it. The ground shook violently beneath my feet, and I knew it was over. There was no stopping the Harbinger now. With trembling hands, I powered up the radio transmitter one last time, hoping, praying that someone, somewhere, would hear me. My voice cracked as I began to speak, the words coming out in a rush of fear and desperation. This is Davian, broadcasting from the Australian outback. The sky, the red sky, it's a warning. It's all connected to an ancient entity, the Harbinger. It's awakening, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. If you're listening, find shelter. Prepare for the worst. The world as we know it, it's ending. The broadcast equipment sparked and hissed as the power fluctuated. I could hear the station crumbling around me, but I forced myself to keep speaking, to hold on to some semblance of hope. The Harbinger is real. It's rising now. I'm sorry. As I finished the transmission, the red sky outside darkened, the hue deepening to a terrifying near black. The earth groaned and cracked, the tremors tearing the station apart. I stepped outside, my heart pounding, and looked up to see the Harbinger. It was massive, incomprehensible, a form so vast it blotted out the sky. Shadows stretched across the land as it rose from the earth, its presence overwhelming, its power suffocating. The last thing I felt was the cold embrace of its shadow, as everything I knew, everything I was, faded into darkness. The world had ended, not with a bang, but with the silent, crushing weight of the Harbinger's return.